I want to welcome you to this Soul Repair webinar, The Implications of Increasing Rates of Military Sexual Trauma for Educating and Supporting Military Chaplains. My name is Nancy Ramsay. I'm the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. The center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families affected by moral injury. Our mission includes offering free monthly webinars that further that mission with a focus on topics that have been inadequately covered or not yet addressed. We are grateful for the support of the Shea Center on Moral Injury at Volunteers of America, which co-sponsors these webinars. The Shea Center is directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, a Senior Vice President for the VOA and founding director of this center. This webinar explores the implications for educating and supporting military chaplains in light of current information regarding the experience of military sexual trauma, recently reported by personnel serving in the U.S. Armed Services. The 2021 Sexual Assault and Prevention Report, abbreviated as SAPPER, released in September of 2022, indicates an extraordinary escalating level of military sexual trauma on military bases and the 3 military academies. This report may also inform our understanding of corresponding escalating rates of suicide by non-combat military personnel, which now exceeds that for combat veterans. We'll explore the implications of the SAPPER report for shaping educational curricula and training of military chaplains to assist their effectiveness in the context of escalating sexual violence and suicide on military bases. I want to remind you that all our webinars are posted as links on this site and at the VOA YouTube channel. Ordinarily, the link is available within 10 days. In the case of today, you will also find there references cited by the presenters, including the paper that was posted with the announcement and the PowerPoint presentation that Dr. Kristen Leslie will include in her presentation. The leadership for this webinar includes the Reverend Dr. Kristen J. Leslie, PhD, a feminist pastoral theologian who addresses issues of survivor resilience in the aftermath of sexualized violence in the United States military, on college campuses, and in post-genocide Rwanda. She is an ordained United Methodist minister, and she has served as parish pastor, a college chaplain, a pastoral counselor, a rape counselor, and seminary professor. She has been a seminary professor of pastoral care and counseling for 25 years and presently serves as the professor of pastoral theology and care at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. She serves on the board of the Soul Repair Center. Her professional responsibilities extend into branches of the armed services. From 2003 to 2005, she served as a subject matter expert at the U.S. Army Air Force Academy, working with chaplains to assess and improve their pastoral services. In 2014 and again in 2018, she secured professional development training curriculum contracts with the Navy Chaplain Corps to equip Navy, Marine, and Coast Guard chaplains and their security details on matters related to military sexualized assault and pastoral care with millennials. During each contract year, she conducted trainings on 8 CONUS and 3 OCONUS bases. Her publications include Ma'am, Can I Talk to You? Pastoral Care to Survivors of Sexualized Violence at the United States Air Force Academy, which is found in the Journal of Pastoral Theology 2005, and Betrayal by Friendly Fire, Military Sexual Trauma and Moral Injury, which is included in War and Moral Injury, a Reader, edited by Robert M. McMaher and Douglas A. Pryor. In this webinar, I will also present. I am the director, as you know, of the Soul Repair Center, and following in the role of chair of the National Advisory Board for the center, I became the director when Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, the founding director, moved to become the senior vice president for Volunteers of America and direct its Shea Center, which focuses on care for veterans. I am an Emerita professor of pastoral theology and care at Brite, where I also served as the executive vice president and dean from 2005 to 2012. Prior to my service at Brite, I served as the Harrison Ray Anderson Professor of Pastoral Theology at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. I recently co-edited with Dr. Carrie Doring military moral injury and spiritual care, resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers, published by Chalice. I'm grateful that the Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, a director of development at Brite, a retired captain in the United States Navy chaplaincy, is serving as the chat monitor. He will also provide Dr. Leslie and me in the final minutes of our presentation. Sam McAllister, on the staff of Volunteers of America, provides his production expertise. Remember, in 10 days to 2 weeks, the recording and related documents will be posted at VOA on this Soul Repair Center site. Dr. Leslie and I decided that I would present first and she will follow. And after we've each presented, we'll have opportunities to talk together, at which time Kyle Fauntleroy will also join us. We look forward to your participation after this. My goals for this presentation include illustrating the increasing severity of the problem of military sexual trauma, described as receptive moral injury, which is greater now than ever before, and to explore and suggest the implications for chaplaincy curricula and priorities for education in the context of the 2021 Sexual Assault and Prevention Report. That report describes that the Army saw the highest increase in sexual assaults by 26% in 2021. It is important to say that the sexual assaults in the branch of the military, there was a 35% increase since 2018 for Army women service members. In 2021, women in the Army reported an 8.4% increase, or 6,200 assaults. Women in the Marine Corps reported a 35% increase, 2,200 assaults. Women in the Army also reported an 8.4% increase, or 6,200 assaults. And women in the Air Force reported a 5.5% increase, or 3,800 assaults. Rates for military sexual trauma in the 3 service academies in 2021 were the highest ever recorded. Similarly, we also know suicides for non-combat active duty personnel now are at new levels. There is likely a correlation given the toxicity and despair for victims that such levels of sexual assault would create on the base. Overall, SAPR recorded that 1.55% of all active duty men and 8.4% of active duty women reported unwanted sexual contact, a predictable indicator that experiences of sexual assault will follow. Also alarming, approximately 25% of the women and 20% of the men reported their offender was in their chain of command. Consider the implications of this reported involvement by members of the chain of command for a service member's sense of safety or the freedom to report. 7% of the men and 20% of active duty women respondents to the SAPR report in 2021 indicated they did not feel safe making even a restricted report. Clearly, there are deeper issues of trust to address. SAPR indicates the population especially at risk is enlisted women and men. While the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021 provides for relocating the investigation of unrestricted reports outside of the current location in the command structure, which will become the work of special prosecutors, is ongoing, but the full enactment of that provision will not be in place until 2027. Even then, clearly the problem is not resolved. Presently, the strategy for persons who make restricted reports may include the offer to reassign victims of assault to another base. However, that often assures that those who are transferred are quickly recognized as victims and increases the likelihood that they will be re-victimized. Further, Since assaults rarely remain unknown among others in a victim's barracks, the context is one of risk and anxiety. And ironically, the strategy of moving the victim leaves the suspected assailant free to continual sexual predation without consequence. Further, Sapper describes a context shaped by anxiety, vulnerability, and lack of trust, which one can easily imagine as related to the rising rates of suicide on bases among personnel who have never been in combat. Suicide on bases among non-combat personnel now exceeds rates among combat veterans. It is also the case that especially enlisted personnel may leave the military early, perhaps as the only way to get out of such a vulnerable context. It may also be relevant to know that in a webinar last spring, which addressed unhoused veterans, a therapist whose client load includes a number of unhoused veterans reported a one-to-one correlation with veterans' experiences of sexual assault. The 2021 Task and Purpose Report for the full SAPR 2021 report information concludes that more than 70% of women in the military and 35% of men were affected by military sexual trauma. This is a stunning figure. So what are the implications of SAPR for chaplaincy training? The recorded level of vulnerability to sexual assault certainly invites attention to training for military chaplains in each of the branches. While each branch requires that chaplains have either a degree in theology and/or training in counseling, many come with no prior course in practices of care and likely no training in responding to sexual trauma. Training for incoming chaplains in every branch is remarkably brief and occasional, so that it might be a year before a new chaplain has more than a 4 to 5 week course. Unfortunately, the introductory courses into 3 services do not include attention to trauma. In some cases, the approach for care is framed by skills to address cognitive practices, which are not responsive to trauma. In other words, chaplains are not equipped with clinical skills that are appropriate for sexual trauma. It is important to take account of the challenge related to the brief series of courses each branch offers to incoming chaplains. New chaplains bring training that is already quite diverse and may include no courses in practices of care and no course for understanding and responding to the trauma of assault, for which many entering chaplaincy have no prior training. This sets up a stressful context for chaplains and a challenging one for survivors of military sexual trauma who come to those chaplains. This thin curriculum is exacerbated by the wide range of readiness among newly inducted chaplains. Let me share some detailed specifics. Currently, among the 3 branches, only the Navy includes training in sexual assault in the intro courses for military chaplains. The Navy includes annual sexual assault prevention and skills for accompanying survivors of assault. The Air Force also provides annual sexual assault prevention skills. The Army basic chaplaincy course is 8 weeks long. It's offered 3 times a year, and it relies on attention to cognitive strategies and does not include attention to forms of difference treated oppressively. The Army provides no training in responding to those affected by trauma, such as sexual harassment and assault. Sexual assault is not included in its elective course on moral injury. The Navy intro course includes 5 weeks of academic instruction, and it does include instruction by the director of its sexual assault program to guide chaplains in accompanying victims of sexual assault. Remember that chaplains do not report assaults. They may accompany active duty victims who choose to report. The Navy course also includes deeper attention to trauma and LGBTQ abuse, as well as annual suicide prevention and annual sexual assault prevention training. The Air Force initial course is 4 weeks and 160 hours for entry-level skills in chaplaincy. 4 hours of that time is given to moral injury, with 2 hours to provide for strategies for responding to PTSD. No attention in this Air Force entry course is given to sexual assault and prevention, or strategies for accompanying survivors of sexual assault. Like the Navy, the Air Force does include annual sexual assault prevention training, and it has instituted attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, though its curriculum is limited by the absence of attention to differences in power related to forms of difference treated oppressively, such as gender, race, and sexuality. In every branch, SAPR describes a context in which personnel lack confidence in the ability and readiness of the command structure to fulfill its commitment to pursue alleged perpetrators when survivors have the courage to make an unrestricted report. Further, we should also clearly name that chaplains are not free from assault. The levels of vulnerability to reassault, the widespread informal knowledge of the fact of assaults, and of the identities of perpetrators create a widespread environment of anxiety and fearful vulnerability. I want to propose 5 priorities. 1, to improve chaplaincy training in responding to survivors of sexual trauma. 2, to assure timeline implementation for the NDAA shifting investigations from the command structure to special prosecutors. 3, to provide much stronger intentionality in addressing rising rates of sexual harassment and assault on bases and in the 3 academies. 4, to improve education for chaplains as frontline personnel when victims have the courage to come forward. And 5, to provide support for chaplains who listen to very difficult reports of sexual violence, knowing they have very little power to prevent this and who themselves are sometimes victimized. Especially important is a priority for equipping chaplaincy leaders in practices of advisement with the command structure regarding strategies for protecting personnel in the present environment. Importantly, the duties for chaplains in each of the 3 forces includes a provision that they advise the command structure on behalf of personnel, even as the new National Defense Authorization 2021 legislation will provide for creating a special prosecutor structure away from the command structure. Advising command on the toxic context is especially important for safety and emotional health. The stated duties for chaplains relevant in the context of sexual assault and prevention include the following. For the Navy and Marines, chaplains are responsible for ethical advising with and for the command. In the Air Force, chaplains are to provide spiritual care and advise leadership related to religious, spiritual, ethical, and moral concerns. The Army chaplains have 2 capabilities: to advise and to provide nurture for the living, care for the wounded, and honor the dead. I look forward to your responses to my proposals later in the webinar. And now I look forward to hearing from Dr. Kristen Leslie.
Dr. Ramsay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation, for the good work that you did in putting the report together that is chock full of such important and hard information to hear. I'm mindful that as we think about the work of military chaplains, Dr. Ramsay has set a high bar. But one of the things that I learned in all the work that I have done with military chaplains is that they're very accustomed to being held to a higher standard than particularly civilians. So military chaplains are up for the task for this important work. I'm mindful that one of the general challenges of thinking about this work in the military is that in general, the military is a closed system. And some of the interventions that are being suggested, including the large bill that's come through Kirsten Gillibrand's office, is in some ways to open the system up for interventions, which is a hard task to do, and yet will be happening. So it will be interesting in the next years to watch how that unfolds. So as Dr. Ramsay named, all branches of the military equip chaplains to attend to spiritual needs, of their own faith communities and to others, to provide spiritual care to the wounded and their families, to advise the command. And that looks a little bit different in each branch, but in general, the chaplains are all equipped to do that. I'm mindful, Sam, if I can have you put the slide up, that the role of the chaplains are varied. So they engage in setting ethical expectations for the unit through their preaching and their teaching and their educating and their care. They engage the unit as they are out and about. They support survivors and they support their families with spiritual care. That becomes a really important thing. They work to support the equipping of the community. And I'll say a little bit more in a bit about bystander behavior training, which is, in fact, what the military has done for quite a while. I'll come back to that. Chaplains play an active role both in the reporting process, both restricted and unrestricted. I know the different branches use a little bit different language with that. And then the role of the chaplain is to advise the command in this, because the chaplains are not, because they are by definition not folks who will break confidences around this information. They play a particularly important role when working with survivors. So in conversations with chaplains, military chaplains, about the work, one of the things that I'm very well aware of is that in order to play out all these roles that you see here in relation to military sexual trauma, it takes a great amount of courage and fortitude to do this hard work, because it means standing in that space where you are needed and where the system is working to keep the system closed, and not getting outside resources in, but also to try to work internally with the system. And so the chaplain is playing that important role in working with survivors, in some cases working with folks who are charged and working with the command. And so they play this pretty important role in that space. To do the work for the chaplains, what is at the very base of the work is building trust. In order for any survivor of military sexual assault to spend any time with a chaplain, they're going to have to trust them enough. And we all know that we can do, one of the things that I say to my students all the time is we as a pastoral caregiver can do everything right. And a care seeker may still not trust us. So the reality of it is, for the role of the chaplain is always to give attention to what it means to build trust, to maintain trust, and to work with someone who, because the system has failed them, to work with them anyways. So that I can't understate it enough what it means for the chaplain to always be engaging in what does it mean to establish and maintain a trusting relationship. Anybody in ministry knows you can do everything right, and then you do one thing wrong, the word gets out, and it really does mar your experience with other folks. So attending to a trusting situation, particularly a trusting relationship, particularly in matters of military sexual trauma, becomes so absolutely crucial. So pastoral skills that are required, you know these skills: showing up and showing up and showing up. Keeping confidences, effective listening and responding at a pace that a care seeker needs and wants, being an advocate for them and for folks, particularly for groups who are already vulnerable, particularly those who have experienced racism and homophobia and sexism, because those systems of oppression absolutely complicate all of this. And then the work of the chaplain is to advise the command, which is both to know the pastoral issues, but also recognizing how this affects the work of the mission, because we know unit readiness, unit cohesion, helping people accomplish the mission. Military sexual assault disturbs all of those. And so we know that it benefits the system to get this under control, so that unit readiness can happen and the mission can be achieved. Sam, the next slide. So this comes from the work of Getting to Outcome, which is guides for strengthening sexual assault prevention in the military. At the end of this slide presentation, I give you some links to some different resources. And this is, I think, a pretty important one, Getting to Outcome. I would encourage you, if you have interest in putting together some training and see what makes the most effective training, they do a really good job, this Getting to Outcomes. So one of the things that they say that any program, prevention program, let me step back and say, the work of the chaplain is in some ways threefold. It is attending to prevention, it is tending to intervention, and then postvention. So prevention, that is helping set an environment so that abuse can't happen. Two, helping the community intervene in those places. And then postvention, which is the healing when assault has happened. How do you work with folks? That's the postvention. So the Getting to Outcome organization talks about these as really important steps for prevention programs, which is starting with naming and decreasing harmful social norms and rape myths. We all know that, and this is particularly including recognizing that military sexual assault and trauma is not predominantly a woman's issue and is not predominantly a gay issue. While we know, Dr. Ramsay read the statistics for how many women and men are assaulted, and the large proportion of women, the sheer number of assault victims, there are more men than women. And it makes sense when you think about it, because there are more men serving. Statistically, there by percentage, more women are assaulted, but the sheer number of men. So military sexual trauma is not just a women's issue, and it's not just too often the stereotype is that someone who is gay, and that is not it. So part of the prevention program is to encourage positive bystander behavior. I want to say a little bit about bystander behavior programs. Colleges and universities in the United States about 15 years ago started doing bystander behavior training because they realized that you can't, it becomes the responsibility of the whole community to change violence rates. And so one of the things that they did was by educating the community, by alerting folks to kind of what are some of the behaviors that might lead to eventual violence, that they could in fact decrease the numbers of the amount of violence, and that absolutely on college and university campuses, bystander behavior training is a really important thing that happens. They train folks continually about it because it doesn't rely on the police force or administration to stop the behavior, but in fact, it happens with the students themselves being able to be alert to the behaviors and intercede in them. And one of the things about the value of bystander behavior training is that it becomes effective when someone who's gone through the training, they know that it is their responsibility, that they can make a difference by intervening. Two, that a bystander behavior training is successful when after going through the training, one gets the impression that they will be respected for intervening. The larger community will respect them. And three, the bystander behavior training actually equips people to know in very practical ways how to intervene. So not just by reporting up the chain of command, but literally bystander behavior trainings are really creative in sometimes even very playful ways, how to help people disrupt and interrupt behaviors that they see coming along before they even get to the violent place. If you do a search for bystander behavior training on college campuses, you'll see lots of examples and lots of videos. But I can't stress enough the importance of positive bystander behavior engagements to attend directly to sexual assault in military environments. Getting to Outcome folks also next say that kind of educating about the risks and the risk perceptions, helping people to know what are personal risks, can you avoid those, and some of those, how can you be in a safe community, and early detection of risk in coercive situations, teaching self-defense skills. In the civilian world, we have long known that teaching for vulnerable populations, to teach them some self-defense skills is important. And then, as always, attending to alcohol use and abuse, because we know the high rates of the correlation between the use of alcohol misuse and sexualized violence. We know it's very high. So getting to outcome, those are the kind of the points that they suggest. Can you go to the next slide? So when I work with survivors, and for those who are survivors on this webinar right now with us, I want to speak to you directly. Care providers, you can listen in if you want. So we are asking a lot of you to go tell the story. And we're asking you that so that you will feel safer and heal. We know that if you feel believed, your healing will be less complicated. And so the system owes you to trust you when you tell your story. When you find a caring professional who's willing to receive your story, here's a checklist. It's important that they meet this checklist so that you can feel safe enough to tell your story. They'll understand your assault as violence and not bad sex. They will keep your confidences. They will assess for your safety and possibly that of your family. They will believe that what you tell them is real and causes you to suffer. They will not doubt you when you tell. They will affirm that the violence was not your fault. You did not bring it on yourself by what you wore, by what you were drinking. Even if you were violating a standard in the moment, you still didn't ask to be violated. A caring professional will discuss reporting options and accept your decision if you choose not to report, even restricted. Understand that reporting with the military system can be re-traumatizing, and perhaps for you, it can feel like worse than the initial assault. We know that. A caring professional will work with you to find networks of support, MST support groups, the VA, friends, support outside the military. It can be, for many survivors, it feels like you want to keep your story to yourself and not reach out to folks. And while that seems to make sense to you, I want to encourage you to find the safe people to talk to, because it can make a huge difference in your healing. A caring provider will tell you that you did not fail the mission. This is not your fault. And they'll see your strength and courage and points of resilience, because to get up in the morning out of your bed and put one foot on the floor and keep moving is a testament to your resilience. And I want to affirm that. So that's a list of things that's a basic for what you can expect from a caring professional who can receive your story. A professional counselor or medical professional or religious professional should never do these things: blame you for the assault, judge you or the decisions you made before, during, or after the assault, suggest that you need to move on more quickly, suggest that forgiveness is easy or even necessary. And I say that as a religious professional. For religious professionals, they should never use religious resources in a coercive way to get you to do things. They should never overshare about their own trauma experience, and they should never ask you to do anything for them physically or sexually. If a doctor or a religious professional or a counselor is not able to meet those basic standards of care, it is very reasonable for you to stop seeing them and find someone else who can provide appropriate care. And there are people out there who can and will do that. Next slide, please. So this is a list of resources that I have put together. The first category is just supportive services. These are all active links. I made sure that they were all up and running. Those will provide some resources for you, the local telephone numbers of where you are if you want to find some help. The RAND Corporation does ongoing research, and they put all sorts of stuff up there that you can find if you're interested in doing more on research. And then prevention, I made mention of this, getting to outcomes. This guide for strengthening sexual assault prevention activities in the military, there's some really good resources up on that link. I would encourage you, anyone, to access those. Friends, you're doing good and important work, and we are appreciative that you're here today with us, because that says that you actually do want to learn, and that will make a difference, and we give you thanks. Thanks. Sam, you can go to the next slide then. Oh, the last slide just had my contact information. I'm at Eden Seminary. You can find me on the website easily. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. All those years of your work thus far with the military certainly showed in that presentation. And I'm wondering if you have further thoughts about what we've said so far. My report that I made originally for the Army, drawn from Sapper, and your own experience of now multiple opportunities, I think working with the Navy and the
Navy, Marines, Coast Guard. Yeah.
Right. I thought you certainly gave us good references. What are the particular concerns that you have given the report that was included in Sapper this year that indicates such a significant rise?
I'm sorry, Nancy, are you asking me what are the particular?
I am. I'm asking you, as you reflect, especially on that very sobering sexual assault and prevention report.
Right. So some of the things that stuck out for me is that a quarter of the reports are the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, is in the chain of command.
Yes.
That is a huge issue, because the way the military works as a closed system, people are not encouraged to go outside the system to get help, either counseling help or legal help. And so it means if they're in your chain of command, you don't have a lot of places to go.
Right.
One of the things that in the work that I did with chaplains, the training of chaplains, is I was so encouraged by both the huge hearts and the huge stamina of these chaplains to sit in the spaces of really hard stories, and wanting to make a difference, and how creative they were in working with their communities on finding healing support for survivors. It's one thing to just put a checklist down of what you need to have in place. It's another thing to recognize the chaplains that do great work is because they're very creative working with their units. Who are the supportive people in their units who maybe not by title, but by charism can be so supportive of survivors.
Mm-hmm. I know that I've tried to imagine the burden for chaplains who hear these stories,
right,
and yet are aware of how limited the possibilities are, at present at least, to address this, to protect the survivor, and to alter the context. This is part of what I learned as I consulted with each of the chaplain schools in developing the report that I shared at the outset. It's a very difficult context in which to be serving as a chaplain.
It is difficult, and the chaplains that I have worked with over the years, I have been so impressed by their call to do this very work. They are there. It's not just a job. It's both a call in a military language and a theological language to do their work. And as they continue to get trained and prepared, it's ongoing training. We all know we can be trained for something once, and some of it sticks, and we need to do it again and again. I'm going to encourage you to do the repeated training as it improves in the training, but also just to work on your skills becomes important for participants here.
Right. I thought one of the other sobering things, and I'm interested if your work in more depth than mine certainly has touched on this, was the percentage of enlisted personnel who were particularly vulnerable. That makes sense to me
Sure.
in terms of the power differentials.
Sure.
But it was helpful to find that statistically evident in this sapper report.
Right. It does make sense. Those with the least amount of power and the least amount of recourse are the most vulnerable in the system. And you add other cultural indicators where someone could be vulnerable, race and sexuality and gender, and it just becomes even more of an issue.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested too, in what kind of ways have you learned that for ways to be allies or to support chaplains? I think I'm not sure that there's much access to really support them in their work in the midst.
Say that again, Nancy. I'm not quite understanding.
Well, what I'm thinking about is they have to keep confidentiality, obviously. And we also know, given the details that this latest report and other reports have confirmed, that their caseload, so to speak, is challenging. And I'm concerned for processes that support them when they are keenly aware of the vulnerabilities of those they serve, and equally aware of their limitations in helping to secure those persons to make it otherwise.
I find it easy to concentrate on those places that all the military protocols are weak. It's easy to get trapped in that. I also do want to uplift some of the things that they do. They do, many of the branches do some regular training, which civilian world we do not. But there is, in some ways, the military operates in this enlightenment model. That is, that they find what's going on, they find an issue, and they build a training around it. I have much respect for that. We don't do that in the civilian world.
Sure.
If we do, we wait until it's much farther down the pike, and the military jumps on those things faster than the civilian world does. Having said that, so we heard from your report, there's lots of places that need work.
Right. My question, perhaps I didn't state it very well. My concern is more working in such a challenging situation. It's the support, just sustaining the morale in a way for folks that are hearing these kinds of reports on a recurring basis. One of the questions that came to you in the chat has to do with what the training looks like in the Navy that you've supported.
So the training that with the PD, the professional development training curriculum that I did, looked at both the statistics within the Navy and the Marine and Coast Guard, just kind of what was going on, looked within the context of the unit, where are some of the resources available, and then what's the role of the chaplain in their provide, facilitate, care, and advise capabilities, that the competencies what they're required to do. So we worked within those. We did a lot of role plays. We did a lot of having chaplains to be very creative in thinking about what do they do that they know they can do that works. So the training that I did both worked with chaplains and their security details, which was an interesting training in itself, because the security detail around the chaplains helps in the midst of that as well. I think there's another question. I'm not following those. Kyle, can you speak that into the space?
Yeah, Kyle, you're welcome to, but you're monitoring this chat too, but part of our conversation with you. Yeah.
I'm trying to do both with integrity.
I know. Only you could do that.
Are there any comments on working in cooperation with sappers, that is the sexual response coordinator and behavioral health? And I kind of feel this chaplain's anxiety about this. How do you appropriately care for folks and not breach confidentiality? That's tough. How do you care for somebody, refer them to the appropriate resource, and not breach confidentiality?
Mm-hmm. Kyle, how did you see that happen? You're the one with that experience here.
I think first of all, you can get permission to do that from the person with whom you're speaking. Yeah. If a service member comes to you, you can get their permission, and that's valid. To talk to a sapper, to talk to a clinician. Because chaplains are not reporters. They can't give a restricted report. We can't give an unrestricted report. So how do we nurture someone through the healing process? We are not mandatory reporters, which is
because you're under
awkward.
the UCMJ and not federal law.
Correct. Thanks for bringing that, for saying that, Kristen. But you can get their permission to do that.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that chaplains are trained with is what is confidentiality and what are the limits of confidentiality, and when can you get help for someone, which is absolutely getting permission from someone to do that.
You have to get their permission. That's pretty much the only way to do it. There are surreptitious ways to do it, but it's still a breach of confidentiality. And a chaplain has to do what she or he can live with. That's the only way I know to answer that, actually.
Right. So I saw two questions that I want to attend to. One is about the bystander behavior training, and then Dr. Rambo, you asked a question about more specifically what's in the Navy training, and they follow Judith Herman's model of trauma-informed care, which is safety first. If someone doesn't feel safe, they can't do much. So helping someone feel safe enough in the environment, helping someone mourn and to name the story and feel believed. And then that third one, which is to build resilience back into the community. When someone's still, you don't feel trust, but what is trust enough? How do you do that? So I think the training have reflected Herman's model itself.
I think it's, can I pile on, Kristen?
Yeah.
I think it's important to say that everyone in the military has an annual requirement to take sexual harassment prevention training. Everyone gets it. That being said, we're still seeing the numbers that the sapper report that Dr. Ramsay spoke of. We still see the numbers increasing.
Exactly.
And I think there are places, whether it's at the battalion level or the ship level, there are echelons where the chaplain is the only care provider available, accessible, quickly accessible. I mean, if you're on an aircraft carrier, sure, you've got more resources, carrying resources. But at the battalion level, the single ship level, in my language, the small boy level, chaplain's the only care provider there. And that gets on top of all the confidence that you hold. Nancy, you brought this up. How does the chaplain take care of the chaplain?
Right. And it's not like the chaplains are immune from sexual assault. It's
as either victim or perpetrator,
well, I
or
mean, especially as a
bystander.
victim. Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think that's a good point, Kyle. And so on the
um,
isolation of a ship in particular, I realize chaplains, and somebody's pointed out on the chat, chaplains can, in confidentiality, speak with one another. But part of what I was concerned for, and your illustration of the ship underscores it, is the increasing burden of just the awareness of how pervasive this pain is that you hear on an ongoing basis. It isn't simple to bear that over the long term. So
and
your
I
point
think
about the ships, though.
and I think your efforts, your recommendations to augment training matters.
Right.
In that the more knowledge we have on practices and care and clinical skills, not that we're going to become a bona fide clinician, that's not our job.
No.
But the more information we understand, the more knowledge we have, armed with the confidence of our faith, and I don't want to minimize that at all. That we are, because we are accessible chaplains, we have to know as much as we can know. We have to study as hard as we can when there's time to do that, if there's time to do that, and proceed with the confidence of our faith and our own spiritual disciplines that equip us to do the job every day and every night.
Yeah. I also want us to talk a bit about what I at least learned in the training, the chaplaincy training, for since persons may enter the chaplaincy with diverse and often not very extensive clinical skills or theory for what they're going to do. But some we see, but at least some of the chaplaincies are using resources that are not attentive to the emotional consequences and harm. So as some of the forces introduce persons to the work of chaplaincy, where we know this kind of pain is everywhere, we haven't given those chaplains who may not have had another course in counseling before they enter the chaplaincy, or only minimal. We need, I think, to be attentive to the resources in those introductory courses that are better able to provide a framework for listening to the kind of trauma that's affective, not a cognitive challenge. So CBT, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, is not going to equip a person when they're sitting next to somebody, who's had this kind of trauma. I welcome y'all's response to that observation.
Someone asked a question while people are typing that in, Nancy. Someone asked a question about what goes on in a bystander behavior training, and there's lots of different groups that do those, but most of them have what's both a passive and a proactive engagement. The passive would be the putting signs up and educating folks about what is inappropriate behavior, what is assaultive behavior, predatory behavior, and helping people to see that. So lifting up an awareness in a community by the training, but also posters around and things. That would be more of a passive, a more proactive one, which is literally helping folks who are in the unit to know how to identify problematic behaviors and interrupt them. There are all sorts of training portfolios that teach you ways to do that, and they're very creative and they're very fun. In fact, one of them actually has a contest in the training. How can you, in the most playful and silly way, interrupt a behavior to do it while it doesn't escalate the anger in someone, but literally does it in a playful way. So the trainings can be have a variety of things, but they're both the passive training, educating folks, and then the passive, how do you interact and interrupt behaviors, become two important parts of the bystander training itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point.
We've got a question about, since the largest religious preference is none, and folks who don't seem to value the presence of chaplains. How does that assessment? I guess I'm not quite sure on how is that assessment received by behavioral health or SARC?
Pastors to some, chaplains to all. The work of the chaplain is to have both to have the faith part, but also the well-being part.
Absolutely.
Chaplains in every branch know that the pastors to some, chaplains to all become important. So I hear that question then is for the nuns, for those who have no faith tradition and perhaps could be suspicious of chaplains. It means building up that much more trust by the chaplain with folks that your purpose is not to convert them. Your purpose is to care for them.
And building relationships, ministry by walking around. Is what matters there, and that goes with building a relationship with other caring resource providers. So I hope that helps. But our main focus is to enhance self-confidence, in my language, self-confidence dependent upon my relationship with God, upon whom I depend. And I'm reacting to one of the other questions right here. Our job is not to be clinicians, but pastors. But we have to be equipped to recognize some kinds of telltale signs of victimization. And be cognizant of what our resources are and where our own limits are, for sure.
Yep. One of the comments in the chat has to do with the fact that there are other emotional health care providers, and that's true. And folks will choose, I think, to whom they might go. It's still, if they come to a chaplain, or the chaplain is certainly going to be mindful that there are these difficulties swirling around. At least every chaplain I've spoken with over the past 3 years is mindful of this challenge on basis. And so it strikes me that even if a person who's been victimized seeks out a family life counselor or someone else, chaplains are still aware they might be talking with other folks who are utterly unsettled by knowing what happened in their barracks. It didn't happen to them that time, but or what a friend has described happened to them, or knowing, the kind of talk, Kristen, that you shared with me, that the word gets out. And there are many folk who, growing up in the United States, have some experience of sexual violence. So come into for the rest of our lives, then there will be that sensitivity, that mindfulness. And when there's that kind of possibility on the base, there's also an anxiety that's broader than the persons who actually experience in one moment or another assault. And I'm guessing, Kristen, that you've also addressed that in the training that you've done.
Nancy, I'm sorry, I was reading one of the chat comments.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was just, it's not only if a person, they might not choose a religious leader
Right, right.
But as Kyle has pointed out, chaplains are broader than responding to a specific faith tradition, to the well-being of the whole.
Mhm.
And what I'm reflecting on is the ways in which there's an increased and generalized awareness that it's not safe, and how that affects people over time is part of what I think would be, and from what I've heard from chaplains, is wearing. It's a challenge in terms of the morale on the whole base, especially with what we've heard that folks, that at least about a fourth, and there's another fourth that didn't feel safe enough to say they'd report anything, that, from it's within the chain of command. That's a tough situation.
So Robert Carter lists the question, are we asking chaplains of the military to operate outside their training in their call? That's not his language, the language I use, but he asked, shouldn't chaplains just be able to refer to mental health professionals to do the work? Kyle, I'll make a statement that I want you to respond to that, which is, particularly in the Navy and the Marines, because chaplains are the only ones with confidentiality, mental health professionals have to report up the chain of command. Am I right?
One more time.
Yeah.
Who reports up the chain of command?
Mental health professionals.
They do.
Right. And so chaplains don't. And so unlike the civilian world, when someone comes as a survivor of sexual assault and needs a support, there are fewer resources for sexual assault survivors if they don't want to report.
Correct.
So they come to the chaplains because in the system itself, that's the place where you can tell your story and it stays there.
It stays there.
That's a huge difference between the civilian world and the military environment.
Right. That's a critical difference, because then if anybody's hearing it, they are.
Right.
So
which suggests why chaplains need the extra training on this, because in the civilian world, we can just say, I'm going to find you a good counselor. Mm-hmm. That's not true.
And because of the diverse pluralistic environment chaplains exist in, mm-hmm. we have to be cognizant of other religious traditions beyond our own, right. So that we can refer if there's an opportunity to refer. In the Navy and Marine Corps at the junior level, if we are not in garrison or on a base, we're not going to have an opportunity to refer, mm-hmm. Because we're all that there is. And I had one more point, but it escaped me. I'm sorry.
It'll come back to you.
Yeah.
So someone said, how do we change the system? Some of it is Kirsten Gillibrand's bill, is how we change the systems, that we open the system, that the chain of command that goes outside of the chain of command to reporting. That's the legal piece. Mm-hmm. There's still much that needs to happen in order for the care piece to happen.
And it seems to me, even when the investigation is moved over time out of the chain of command, the important work of advising remains. So let's explore that further, because how you two have more experience actually of how that might work, but it does seem to me that we want to encourage each of the chaplaincy schools in the training and the training overall for new persons entering. There needs to be training for chaplains about how this advising works, and the courage, the honesty, the openness on the chain of command to hear. So you two have more experience with that. It's clear to me, and it was clear to me in conversation with some of the colleagues I met in the three different branches, that the creating a stronger process of advising is important. Can we talk about what that might look like?
I think this is one of those required skills, abilities, knowledge that surpass the requirements we had to meet when we were ordained. And that's why supplementary training and education is so important. Because that advising the chain of command is an art. It's full of nuance. I mean, you have commanding officers who just want the brass tacks. How do you do that without breaching confidentiality? How do you talk in broad strokes? And that's diplomacy in many ways, but we have to communicate with the chain of command, because the commanding officer is responsible for every soul, the well-being of every soul on that ship, in that command. They have to know. And that's just, I don't know of anybody ever teaching me how to advise the chain of command. I mean, we had in chaplain school, we had role plays, and we would bring in commanding officers from the war college, either folks who had command or going to command. And that just gives you a sense of the gravity of the information you're exchanging with the commanding officer, that he or she is responsible, and they take this seriously, that they need to know this stuff, but how it's delivered, and because what we think is important may not be important to the CO. You know, she or he may or may not think it is, and we don't know that. We can't read their mind. So we have to deliver it in a methodical, deliberate manner, with all the information that we have available. The commanding officer may or may not ask us our opinion of that information. I've never had a commanding officer ask me how I feel about the information that I've just delivered, but they will ask me, what do I think, and what's a plan of action to solve whatever the issue is.
Right.
And the chaplain then has some power there then.
Yes.
Well, you have power and obligation. Because I would also think that no commander of a base or a ship wants to learn that their base or their ship had an increase in reports, and that there's a sense of insecurity even from colleagues within the command structure. That is, insecurity on the part of, I realize the sapper doesn't disclose that, but it would seem to me somebody in the command structure would read that and think, how are we assuring that this context is different?
It's interesting if you go to a CO and said, sir or ma'am, I understand that you have this many unrestricted reports. How many restricted reports do you have? How many reports do you not have?
Mm.
And when you put it in terms like that, they will probably say, chaplain, are you aware of incidents that are not being reported? If you answer affirmatively, are you betraying confidence? Does it become, by definition, a report?
How could it be a report if you're not, all you're saying, I mean, it seems to me what you're confirming is the person's suspicion that everybody's not coming forward, and that you know that. And that, to my mind, that's an important question for the command staff to ask. What are the consequences if that were you and you went and you had to answer that question?
What are the consequences? If
For
you
you,
don't
I mean, if
answer
they
it,
said-
is the chaplain, is the CO going to fire the chaplain because of not divulging everything the chaplain knows.
But the CO knows you can't.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, so part of what I think my conversations with the schools and certainly this devastating sapper report is, renewed conversations about the priority of reporting to the command. I mean, of advisement is the right word to use, of conversation, because that's an obligation of chaplains, and chaplains, even if they're not the person to whom a victim may choose to come, they're mindful of the level and the harm that exceeds the harm to the particular victim.
This is the significance in my mind of the report, of the sapper report, because it's not just restricted and unrestricted reports. I mean, for years, the toothpaste has been out of the tube on this. That doesn't mean that every person in authority appreciates not knowing the whole story of their command.
Right.
And in my mind, not only do chaplains need to be as equipped as possible for this, not just this topic, military sexual trauma, but everyone in a leadership position, everybody goes through leadership development training, whether you're E6, 7, 8, 9, every level of command has training attached to assuming that position. This needs to be talked about.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And knowing that there's always going to be information that you don't have because somebody's not going to report because they don't feel safe.
Because they aren't safe.
Because
I was going to say because they aren't.
They aren't safe.
Right.
Having a command structure, a command team that understands that would be awesome.
So maybe part of the education that we're talking about is not just for the chaplains,
Absolutely.
But at another level, and that's important. I want to bring up a topic that we haven't talked about yet, that's disclosed in the sapper report, and that is unspoken presently in some of at least the level of detail I've had in conversation about chaplaincy training. And that has to do with the differences in power that exist, whether that's gender or race. One of the things that sapper underscores is that the most vulnerable were enlisted personnel. Well, on a military base, that's one signifier of inequity or differences in power. And we know that in forms of difference treated oppressively, that treated oppressively has to do with inequities that may well precede a person coming in. It's related to sexuality, race, gender, class. Those things also permeate a base. It's not like we check all of that before we come in. So part of what I'm paying attention to is the clear vulnerability of enlisted personnel. Some of those depart early from their term, their enlistment, or leave sooner than they might have. And I'm part of what I'm struck by as I listened carefully and gratefully to the staffs in the chaplain schools, each of the schools, is less attention, and some no attention named, for the ways these forms of difference that in our culture are often treated oppressively enter the military context and would likely shape forms of vulnerability, as the sapper reports, for example, with enlisted or officers. But in other webinars, in fact, one that you led, Kristen, I think 2 years ago, certainly the Black women and Asian women described a different level they experienced of vulnerability, as I recall from that webinar, that these things are also part of what creates vulnerability, including vulnerability to sexual misconduct, to harassment, if not assault. And these are not, these realities are not as well addressed presently in the curricula as I have understood them. And as I know, inform experiences of sexual misconduct, of sexual harassment. So I wonder if either of you, and Kristen, you were the person that moderated that webinar January 2 years ago, I think. What is your sense of the ways in which this is important, for example, for chaplains and for other mental health providers on the base, as well as the command structure?
Go for it, Kyle.
These are hard questions, Nancy.
Well, it's a hard experience.
Yeah, it's you know, we talk about command climate, and the whole command, and when you talk about a base, Nancy, you're talking about dozens of commands.
Yeah.
And but the command climate, everyone has to buy in. The whole command has to buy in from top to bottom. It's more than the COXO and Sergeant Major. It's more than the COXO and Command Master Chief. It's got to be every level of leadership. Has to buy into the training, and that's hard to do. To treat someone like your primary next of kin, in our language. If you wouldn't want it to happen to your son or daughter, then you can't allow it to happen to someone else's son or daughter.
Right.
That's the attitude that we have to take when we talk about this. The annual training is a computer-based training. You sit at your computer and you punch the button, and it's the same training every year. Sometimes they change a slide or two, or a vignette or two. But it has to be talked about out loud, in mixed company.
Right.
And it's, you're right when you highlight that there are those who are more vulnerable than others. We haven't talked about folks who have been victims who come to the military supposing it's a safe place.
Exactly. That was my next thing. Yeah.
And they're going to be re-victimized, or they have the potential to be re-victimized, probably
Right.
more than someone who hasn't been victimized.
Well, they're going to feel the vibrations. They're going to know this is a risky place, and that's in itself going to be stressful.
So what are the series of decisions that we can make as individuals and as a team to mitigate the damage?
Right.
You know, whether we're a good driver or not, we're still going to put on a seatbelt.
Because it's the law.
Right. And legal bears a big responsibility when it comes to healing.
Yes.
Whether it's an individual or a command. Because when commands lose at least two people, a victim and a perpetrator, the command's going to hurt. Regardless of our relationship with those individuals, we've lost two key elements of the command structure. of getting the job done, whatever the mission is. We've lost at least 2 people, probably a whole lot more.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm trying to lift up is that among the things that this particular issue poses for chaplaincy training or for other mental health provider training and in general, the training is the attention to differences in power and the ways in which if a person enlists or enters the military, who is more likely to assault, if that the inequities that pervade our culture will enter the base. And at present, attention to these forms of difference treated oppressively and their consequences and practices of care are not well represented in the instruction for chaplains, not as I have been tutored in those practices. And I do think that that's another aspect that's related to addressing the challenges that this webinar particularly focuses on. Does that make sense to you, to the 2 of you?
Yes, yes.
And that material is there. And part of why I think it's related is that sexual abuse is about the abuse of power.
It's absolutely that. Yeah.
It's not consensual sexuality that went wrong. It's abusive practices that may use the medium of sexuality. So helping chaplains who may not have had a course about this, may not have had any training about this in previous theological training, helping everybody get on board about this, it strikes me, is an important ingredient to more effective care on a base. I'll let you all comment on that. I think I've written that as far as I should.
Well, I mean, you keep talking about a base, and there are resources on a base.
Well, or a boat or a ship.
A ship, don't say boat, Nancy.
I know. I corrected myself as quickly as I could.
It's
a kayak.
I mean, the challenge we've got to confront is time to train.
Yes.
With the operational, understanding the isolation of the typical chaplain, whether battalion chaplain, ship's chaplain, whatever. We've got to factor in time to train, and
Yes.
that's a huge challenge because the military has more opportunities for chaplains than they do chaplains.
Mhm.
And the article in the Stars and Stripes yesterday just pointed out that the destroyer squadron in Japan is going to start putting chaplains on every destroyer. That's assuming we have chaplains to put on the destroyers, but they're going to deploy in different directions. And those chaplains are going to be isolated with a corpsman and an enlisted medical person who's very competent and capable at mending wounds that you can see, not wounds that you can't necessarily. So those are the challenges, but having the freedom around the ship, around the battalion to talk about stuff, whether it's at NDOC or leadership training or periodic training events within the life of the given unit, to bring this up and talk about it out loud en masse, where everybody's in the room. These are the opportunities we need to seize, and then count on the legal structure to do their job appropriately.
Right. Kristen, we're very close to the end, and I'm wondering if there are particular thoughts you'd like to share before we bring this to a close.
So as I've been listening to you, one of the challenges that I always find when I think about pastoral care in any closed environment is I tend to use the language of a therapeutic community. The military is not a therapeutic community. It's got a mission. It needs good order and discipline and unit cohesion to achieve it. And part of advising as Kyle, you and I have had many conversations on this, kind of the role of the chaplain in advising the command structure, and that the real challenge, it's both an art and having to know protocols and things and what's reasonable to suggest and not, and it's not a therapeutic community. So how do you frame it in such a way? You end up framing the work in such a variety of different ways. One, when seamen are safest enough, when they're safe enough, they're more likely to help folks achieve the mission. You can achieve the mission when everyone's healthy. It's easier to do that. And so to frame it, you have to frame it that way. And chaplains are into the work of spiritual wholeness and compassion. And Nancy, as you were talking, I think about part of the work, the trauma-informed care, kind of that third step, is helping to build resilience with the help of a community. Well, when someone has experienced kind of a morally injurious experience where the whole language of trust is just shattered, how do you do that? Part of the work that the chaplains do is so almost Sisyphus. It's you're having to do the incredible work in the context, not Kyle, in the environment you just named, to be able to hold up goodness and compassion and honor. That becomes the task of the chaplain, to do that. And there are other folks who are doing that as well, but that is a task of the chaplain. I'm again mindful of the really important role that the chaplains play in a really hard environment. The compassion and the goodness and honor becomes so crucial.
I think you've also summarized what so many say. I mean, even if they no longer espouse or hold to some particular religious tradition, that loving neighbor as ourselves, the research suggests that's sort of the baseline spirituality that many persons embrace, regardless of a particular tradition. And that's related, I think, Kristen, to what you've just said. We've come to the end of the time for this webinar. I want to express gratitude for the persons that have hung in there with us through this complete hour and a half, and much gratitude to Dr. Leslie and to Kyle Fauntleroy for their participation with us. Thank you so much. And remember, you all, that a tape of this and the resources such as Dr. Leslie's PowerPoint are available attached to the link for this webinar, probably in about 10 days, at our site and at the VOA site. Thank you very much.